We're not talking about billions here. We should be talking about cuts in trillions if we're serious about addressing America's fiscal problems. With the exception of tax hikes, which in my opinion will destroy American jobs, everything is on the table.
House Speaker John Boehner throwing down the gauntlet in negotiations over raising the federal debt ceiling. Here's that debt clock again. We've got a live picture there in New York, and it waits for no one. Soon, the numbers will crash through the debt ceiling, exceeding the amount the U.S. is legally allowed to borrow. The stakes couldn't be higher, so what is the solution? Joining me now, Doug Holtz-Eakin, who ran the Congressional Budget Office and served as John McCain's chief economic advisor in 2008. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman of the New York Times. Sheila Bair, who's wrapping up her term as chairman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And Roger Altman, a former Deputy Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. Thank you all for being here. This seems to be a never-ending conversation, but the limit we're now hitting up against. How is President Obama to respond to the call for trillions, not billions of dollars in cuts?
I think he cannot. If he gives in on this, he's setting himself up for repeated blackmail. He's basically saying that I care about the economy more than the Republicans do, and therefore every time they threaten to blow it up, even though it'll hurt all of us, I'm going to give in. So I think Obama's got really very little wiggle room, even though it's a terrible thing.
Lots of economists are saying the Republicans are playing with fire, that hitting the debt limit, exceeding it, is not like shutting down the government. It could cause a real cascading economic crisis.
I don't think there's any great desire to hit the debt limit. The key is to recognize the limit is a symptom and that the fundamental problem is the underlying condition of the U.S. budget. What you're seeing now are calls for, either both from Speaker Boehner and from the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, for real solutions to the real problem. It's not about the debt limit. It's making sure that in the short term you get cuts, the medium term you have an enforceable path, and that you take care of something in the long term. The entitlements have to be on the table.
So we do keep hearing this now. There obviously seems to be the momentum for dealing with entitlements. But how? How does one deal with Medicare and Medicaid? We already saw Paul Ryan and his plan for Medicare. They seem to be running away from it now. So how does one deal with this in a way that's real rather than just ideological, if that's possible?
Right. Well, I'm a bank regulator. I'm not a budget expert, as some of these other gentlemen are, but we have been following this very closely because we are very concerned about the outcome and how it could impact the financial sector. But I've also worked in Washington a long time, and it seems to me that if the pain is evenly distributed and the general population feel that there's fairness in whatever ultimate outcome is agreed to, I hope, by the administration and the Congress, then I think politically it can sell. I do think that both sides have a point. Last November, I published an op-ed in the Washington Post where I said if we didn't get these deficits under control, I thought it would precipitate the next financial crisis. I also agree with the administration, though, that it's irresponsible to even entertain an idea of even a so-called technical fault on the public debt. So I think both sides have a point. And I hope they come together. And gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I think maybe there's a little too much testosterone in this debate. It's too much about winning and losing and not enough. Both sides are right. Let's come together and have a solution.
What would a default mean? What impact would it have?
Well, when I hear all this discussion about not voting to raise the debt limit, absolutely not, and so forth, as we just heard earlier on the show, I have to roll my eyes a bit because, as Doug said, the debt is a product of past budget decisions. And we have no alternative, therefore, but to raise the debt limit. For example, we're running a deficit this year of between 1.4 and 1.5 trillion. Those amounts have to be borrowed, just like a household, which is spending more than it takes in. It has to raise cash. So there's no alternative but to allow the United States to continue to borrow. Therefore, the debt limit has to be raised. And should we somehow fail to do that, and there be a default, I agree with what the Fed Chairman Bernanke, said this past week, which is that it would have severely destabilizing impacts. In fact, he said it would probably bring back the severe chaos we saw in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the fall of 08.
U.S. debt, it's not just that our credibility is on the line, that people could get spooked by the fact that we start to look like a banana republic. But it's also that U.S. debt plays a very special role in the world system, right? A U.S. Treasury bill is the gold standard of value, so much so that during the height of the financial crisis, there were intervals where U.S. Treasury bills had negative interest rates, because that's what people had to hold. And if you're going to suddenly say, oh, that's not safe because the U.S. government is a bunch of squabbling children, that is a real possible catastrophe.
And even the Chamber of Commerce leader is saying that it's time to make this deal, raise the debt, and not even talk about cuts right now.
That's right, because the cuts issue, I'm sorry, I'm waiting, but it's a huge thing not to be settled in a few weeks of frantic yelling.
Mm-hmm.
So the U.S. is very unique in that it has a debt limit. So imagine we didn't have one. We'd have an enormous problem. We're on track to literally create a new financial crisis given the trajectory. So dealing with the problem has to be the top priority. The prospect of that financial crisis is anti-growth. It hurts the most important job, which is jobs. And so I think the important thing is for the Democrats, who ultimately control this town and need to provide the leadership on this, to recognize that dealing with the problem, not the debt limit symptom, is the key. And that's the route to real success.
But you just made an important point, which is that the business community and the financial community, which are largely Republican, are entirely united in urging all of Washington, but especially the Republican side, to pass the debt limit, don't trifle with it, and certainly don't trifle with default. And I think that's significant.
And the last thing I'd say on this is important to recognize that 9 out of 10 Americans oppose just a pure increase in the debt limit. So let's face it, this is a political exercise. They can't just raise the debt limit. That's politically absolutely unacceptable. They need to both raise it and fix the problem.
And you also heard Speaker Boehner saying that everything's on the table except taxes. Is that battle basically, Sheila, being completely won now or settled? It's just not going to happen?
I think that's a good question. I think probably everything should be on the table. I think there's a difference between raising tax rates and tackling tax expenditures. And I think there is the potential for a very broad bipartisan consensus on getting rid of most of these tax expenditures, which are very distorting for the economy. And some of them were a driver of the crisis. For instance, the mortgage interest deduction heavily subsidized a lot of leverage with home borrowers. The favorable treatment we give debt over equity financing also encouraged leverage with financial institutions. There's a tremendous amount of potential revenue that could be raised through tackling tax expenditures, and it seems to me where the most likely place for bipartisan consensus is. But tax revenues do need to go up. I think that needs to be part of the solution.
And this week, President Obama said to the Democrats, don't draw any lines in the sand. Be flexible on this.
Well,
on not particularly this issue, but in general.
And there's a problem because if you are playing the responsible adult in the room and the other guy is willing to blow up the room, if he doesn't get exactly what he wants, that puts you in a bad negotiating position. I think there have to be some lines in the sand. There have to be, we're not going to dismantle the New Deal and the Great Society in a couple of weeks because the Republicans refuse to raise the debt limit.
What would each one, I want to go around the table and ask you, what would each one of you want to see coming out of these debt ceiling talks that are going on right now? What is the best case scenario?
Well, I think there will have to be, as Doug said, a serious agreement to cut the deficit, or a down payment, as the administration is talking about, negotiated beforehand, and then pass the debt limit increase in effect in exchange for that. So there'll have to be a serious budget agreement. It'll just be a down payment. It won't solve the entire $4 trillion 10-year problem. But if it's not serious and pretty large, then I don't think it'll get the votes to pass the debt limit.
I guess I would like to see even more than that and have a long-term plan. A $4 trillion over 10 years, I think, was a good number. I think the Bowles-Simpson plan wasn't perfect, but it was a good framework, a good example of how the pain could be evenly distributed. But I agree, some short-term down payment and some meaningful time sequencing to get this done. I think that is necessary for credibility.
I think it may be necessary to take this up to the limit, because the fact of the matter, we do not have, possibly if we have demands for a large change in policy under threat of the debt limit, this has to be the point where you say, no, we don't believe in letting hostages be taken.
Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I respect Paul, but I don't. I think default would be a profound and hugely negative step. I think it would be terribly destabilizing. I think it would reduce the amount of institutions and around the world that would, in the future, buy Treasury debt and be a tremendous mistake.
Let me make my case here. But let me just say, we have an enormous budget dispute. We have vastly opposed poles of policy. That is not something that we should resolve with a bomb hanging over our head. It's not something we should try and change. And so Democrats have to make clear that they're not going to let themselves be blackmailed in that way.
The first choice is real solutions. So real cuts in the near term, real targets over the medium term, and real changes in entitlement programs. It has to be the most convincing thing for markets to see actual changes in policy. It's what Americans know has to be done, and it's what would be best for the country. The backup is just a framework. We promise to hit this target or that target with enforcement. That's less compelling. Might be easier to say, but less compelling.
An article, story that's in the Washington Post today talking about the negotiations between Vice President Biden and congressional leaders, talking about federal pensions and what would amount to, about a 5% cut in salary. Is that a goer?
I believe as a matter of politics, the federal government employees can't be exempt from whatever the deal is. The perception that somehow everything has to change for Americans, but that the sheltered few in D.C. are exempt, that's not going to fly.
Can I just say, I really, I'm sorry, but I'm truly frightened by even suggestions that we could default on Treasury debt. I think, the knock-on impact of that would be tremendous. We would lose, I assume, our AAA credit rating. A lot of institutions who currently hold Treasuries would no longer be able to hold them. They would have to liquidate them. That would create tremendous down pressure on bond prices. The fact that interest rates would spike in terms of what Treasury has to pay, those yields, all consumer and business credit price off of Treasury yields. So borrowing costs for the real economy would go up. Both consumers and businesses now are very hesitant and uncertain, so they're not committing capital. If their borrowing costs go up, it will be very detrimental to the economic recovery. So I'm sorry, but I think it truly frightens me. I don't think we should be talking about it.
I'm also terrified by a blackmail political system.
Well, on that note, on that terrifying note, we're going to have to pick this up another time.